I thought I'd bought a cheap cabin, but now a woman fishing in the basement says she's my wife. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Late autumn had settled unevenly over the Wyoming foothills, leaving patches of frozen grass next to strips of turnu. The air carried a fine bite, and a pale twilight stretched across the narrow trail as Richard Bungito strode wearily toward the old cabin he'd bought 2 days earlier. He rode with a steady posture, his shoulders straight beneath a coat that had survived too many winters. Richard was 38, a former ranch hand who'd burrowed across Wyoming after leaving a job that ended in violence he didn't talk about. He wanted distance from crowded cities, arguments, and the kind of work that required him to stand next to men he didn't trust. The cabin offered isolation, and that was enough. He dismounted and stretched his back, listening to the silence around him. The nearest village was almost a full day's ride away, and no smoke rose from the neighboring fields. He preferred it this way. The quiet meant fewer questions and less chance of his past catching up with him. His goal was simple: rebuild the property over the winter, raise a few horses in the spring, and remain alone. Richard led his horse to the tie post. The Porsche sagged under its own weight. A corner beam leaned outward, and the steps were worn in the shape of whoever had lived here before. He didn't know the man's name. He hadn't asked. All he'd been told was that the previous owner had abandoned the property without settling his debts, and the cabin had been put up for sale in a hurry. Richard had paid less than he'd expected, which had made him cautious, but not enough to make him leave. Cheap land rarely came without problems. He opened the door and stepped into the dark interior. The hinges looked stiff from dislodging, and the smell of dust and wood wafted through the air. A single warped table leaned against the wall. A broken chair lay overturned. Cobwebs stretched in the corners. Richard lit his lantern and hung it on a nail beside the window frame, letting the warm glow settle on the uneven floorboards. He inspected the room with an eye accustomed to making repairs. The roof joints needed reinforcing. The floor had weak spots. A cold draft crept under the walls, nothing he couldn't handle. He was used to working alone, used to building things from scratch. He paced back and forth across the room, noting the supplies he would need and how many days the repairs might take. He mentally divided the tasks, reminding himself that winter would arrive quickly and that he needed the cabin secured before the first heavy snowfall. As he unpacked his equipment, a faint noise rose from beneath the ground, a controlled, repetitive sound that didn't match the wind or the settling of wood. Richard stopped instantly, his instincts sharpened. Years spent on ranches, herding cattle across hostile territory, had trained him to pay attention to anything that moved. He waited for the noise to repeat itself, barely holding his breath. It came again, a slight shift in weight, a shallow breath. His chest tightened. He wasn't so much surprised as immediately alert, calculating the possibilities. A trapped animal, someone hiding, something left behind by the previous owner. He walked to the cellar door in the far corner. The latch was rusty. He pressed his thumb against it, feeling the resistance before forcing it open. The metal scraped in a hard line. He lifted the door slowly, controlling the movement so it wouldn't slam. Cold air rose more sharply than in the room above. He raised the lantern and descended halfway before stopping to look. A woman was huddled in the far corner. Her posture told a whole story before she spoke. Arms raised to block blows that might never come. Knees drawn up tight, shoulders tucked in. Her long black hair fell around her face in tangled strands, and the thin cloth wrapped around her body seemed inadequate against the cold. Rope marks encircled both wrists. Her bare feet were pressed into the earthen floor, her toes curled as if pushing back. She wasn't moving to attack, she was preparing to receive one. Richard held the lantern steady, letting her see clearly. He didn't move forward. He didn't lower his voice to soothe her. He simply stood there, waiting, trying to understand what he was seeing. The tension pinched tightly behind his ribs, but he forced himself to remain calm. Her breathing quickened. When she finally spoke, her words broke unevenly. He said, "You're my husband now." She swallowed hard, as if the words themselves hurt her throat. Richard immediately felt the weight of the situation. The one who had lived here before had done something to her. She believed she now belonged to him simply because he owned the cabin. A pressure settled in her chest, not from fear but from anger directed not at her, but at the circumstance he had trapped her in. "I bought this place yesterday," he said. "No one told me you were here." She stared at him, unable to decide whether his statement meant safety or danger. Richard recognized that look. He'd seen it on people who anticipated disappointment before it arrived. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled. He took a half step forward instinctively, but stopped instantly when she stepped back. He needed to earn her trust without force. He took off his coat and held it out from a distance, giving her time to decide. Her eyes flicked from the coat to his face, searching for deception. When she took it, her hand trembled so badly she almost dropped it. "My name is Acha," she murmured. "Richard," he replied. Her expression remained guarded. She wasn't reassured yet. She had no reason to be. "Let's get out of here," he said. She hesitated, then followed him slowly, leaning on the stair railing. He maintained a moderate pace, making sure never to get close enough to jostle her. When she entered the main room, her body straightened as she took in the cabin, the empty walls, the dark ceiling beams, the single lantern. Her eyes darted between the door and the windows, checking for escape routes. Richard crouched at the hearth and arranged the firewood. He lit a match, watching the flame creep across the hearth. The room gradually warmed up. Acha stood several paces away, still wrapped in her cloak, watching his every move with tense attention. He laid a blanket on the floor near the fire. She hesitated but finally sat down. Pulling the blanket was pulled tight around her. Her fingers were cold and stiff. She held her hands near the fire without getting too close, as if she wasn't sure warmth was something she could rely on. "Did the man who lived here before lock you down there?" Richard asked. She nodded once. "He left. Belly first, say someone would come for me." Richard's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath before speaking again. "No one's coming for you now, not like this." She studied him carefully, trying to decide whether to believe him. Her pulse was still racing, but her breathing slowed. Her thoughts were swirling. He had intended to spend the winter fixing up a neglected property, working with his hands, staying away from others. What he had found instead was a woman who had been left in a cellar like an object. She needed safety, food, warmth, a chance to figure out her own options. His mission had changed the moment he opened that door. Cellar, whether he liked it or not. Acha sat in silence, absorbing the fire, the heat, the room above the ground. She didn't relax completely, but the rigid fear in her posture softened. Richard settled on the other side of the room, giving her space while keeping her in sight in case she needed anything. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him, not forced, but inevitable. Outside, the wind swept across the valley, calm but steady. Inside, for the first time since entering the cabin, Richard felt the gravity of someone else's survival resting beside his own. Acha didn't thank him, and he hadn't expected it. They were simply sharing the same room, each assessing what kind of person the other might be. A long beginning, a certain something had taken shape between them, and both understood that nothing from this night would be easily forgot. The fire grew higher as evening fully settled in, filling the cabin with a steady glow that softened the rough edges of the worn interior. Acha sat wrapped up in Richard's coat, her legs were folded beside her, her fingers hovering above the light, as if testing whether the heat was truly meant for her. Her breaths came slow and uneven, the earlier panic still coursing through her body. Richard placed another log in the flames and adjusted it with the poker. Careful not to disturb Bruce men, he positioned himself at the small table across the room, giving her space while keeping her safely within sight. The table wobbled slightly as he set down a cup of extinguished wood. He made a mental note to fix her feet in the morning. Acha watched her every move with the focused attention of someone who had spent too much time preparing for danger. She didn't speak, but her eyes revealed constant calculation. Richard reached for the salt bag and took out a small packet of dried beans and a box of salt. He poured the beans into a saucepan, added water, and placed it on the grill over the fire. The aroma rose slowly as it heated. Acha would be said to the sound of boiling water made it sound as if even harmless noises had become threats after so long underground. Finally, she asked cautiously and calmly, "Are you making food for me?" "For both of us," he replied. Her gaze lingered on the pot, trying to decipher the intention behind his offer. She had been deprived of the simplest comforts long enough that even a meal seemed suspicious. Without looking directly at her, Richard asked how long they had been kept down there. Acha took her time before answering. She looked toward the cellar door, her face tightening. I didn't count the days, dark all the time. He gave me food sometimes. Not much. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. I was waiting. He left. No, he came back. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't press her. She had given him the truth she could handle for now. He measured her breathing, seeing that the memory troubled her more than the words themselves. He stirred the pan gently. Letting the sound of the spoon break the silence, Akam moved closer to the fire and looked down at the floor. "Why are you buying a house if there's trouble here?" she asked cautiously. "I didn't know," Richard said. "I wanted a quiet place, away from people, nothing more." She studied him again, trying to decide whether solitude made a man dangerous or safe. Her shoulders dropped slightly, though she remained alert. Richard took the pot off the grate and filled 2 bowls. He placed one on the floor near her without entering her space. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing the rim as if afraid it would be snatched away. She tasted a small spoonful, chewing slowly, testing for anything unexpected. When nothing harmful followed, she ate another. "You cook better than the old man," she said under her breath. Richard exhaled through his nose, something between a tired laugh and relief, but he didn't comment. He ate in silence, sitting cross-legged near the table. The lantern above him flickered. In seeing shadows on the walls, Acha observed his posture. Calm, reserved, careful not to encroach on his side of the room. After finishing half his bowl, Ha set it aside and clutched his coat tighter. "You know, I want a woman here." The question carried no hint of flirtation, only the fear of what men usually expect. Richard placed his bowl on the table. "I didn't come looking for anyone," he said simply. "But I'm not throwing you out." Acha absorbed this with visible tension in her jaw. She took in the cabin again. The fire repaired, the blanket beneath her, the open space that didn't feel like a trap. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted. "You don't have to decide tonight," Richard said. Her eyes moved to the window. Horsh's darkness seemed safer than the cellar had ever been, but she still looked at it uncertainly. "No men come for me?" she asked. "Not while I'm here," he replied. She weighed the sincerity of his tone, his steady voice, his controlled movements, and the way he kept his distance. Everything began to form an image in her mind that didn't fit the man he'd locked away. Richard got up and brought out a spare cot, placing it near the hearth, but a good distance from his spot. "Take this, the fire will keep you warm." She looked at the cot, then at him, making sure she understood. "You sleep here," she pointed to the opposite corner. "Yes." Acha released a breath she'd been holding. She touched the blanket beneath her as if to ground herself, then lowered her voice. "You strange men," she said, not unkindly, just honest. "I've been called worse," he replied. For the first time since he'd found her, the tight line between his brows softened. Not a smile, just a small easing of fear. As the fire settled into a steady burn, Richard took off his boots and checked the pistol he kept near the table. He wasn't worried about Acha, but about whoever might come looking for what he thought he still possessed. He glanced at the door, planning already a stronger lock for tomorrow. Acha watched with a new kind of attention. Not fear, but curiosity. "Do you have family?" she asked softly. "No," he said, "not anymore." She didn't ask what had happened. She sensed the boundary without being told. The room quieted. The fire crackled softly. Acha lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Her eyes closed slowly, though she kept them slightly open for several minutes, checking the room again and again. Richard sat at the table until she finally fell asleep. Her breathing changed, settling into a steady rhythm. Only then did he allow himself to rest on his own cot facing the door, one hand near the pistol, not out of fear of her, but because he had seen enough cruelty in his life to know that it rarely ended cleanly. Before sleep overtook him, he glanced once more at the green shop. She was asleep, curled up inside, her coat wrapped around her small frame, no longer hidden beneath the floor, but still fighting against the habits captivity had ingrained in his bones. Richard turned his gaze to the ceiling, aware that tomorrow would bring new decisions, repairs, and questions neither of them yet understood. This was the first night the cabin had sheltered 2 people, quietly trying to survive their own stories, sharing a fire neither had planned for, but both needed more than they realized. Gray light filtered through the cracked window when Richard opened his eyes. The fire had burned down to a warm bed of embers, and the air inside the cabin carried a slight chill. He sat up slowly, his joints aching from sleeping on the uneven floorboards. Before doing anything else, he looked toward the hearth. Gis huddled under the blanket, her coat still tightly wrapped around her. Her breathing was steady. She didn't look peaceful. Her hands were clasped close to her chest, as if a part of her body was preparing itself out of habit. But she was sleeping above ground, and that mattered. Richard got up quietly and went to the door to check the weather. Frost coated the edges of the porch. The trees rustled softly, more with cold than wind. He cut near the toe post, steam rising from his breath. The world seemed quiet enough for Richard to listen for anything unusual. Footsteps, distant hooves, men talking, but he heard nothing. He went back inside and closed the door quietly. Pointed Chat stirred at the sound. Her eyes snapped open, sharp and alert before she recognized where she was. Her shoulders dropped a little, but the tension remained in her posture as she pushed herself into a sitting position. "You wake up early," she said, her voice still heavy with sleep. "Always," he replied, pulling on his boots. She scanned the room again, confirming that she hadn't changed overnight. "I was thinking of maybe selling it again," she admitted calmly. "You won't go back there," he said firmly. The certainty in his tone, the thread stopped. She studied as if trying to understand why a man would make a promise without expecting anything in return. Richard made a small gesture toward the sodomy. "You can wash up if you want. I'll get more." Acha hesitated, dug her head. She waited until he left before standing fully. Her legs trembled slightly as she stood, showing how long she had been confined. She held onto the edge of the table for balance. Outside, Richard carried fresh water from the well. He filled the bucket, sweeping the edge of the trees for any movement. The isolation was comforting, but the encounter in the cellar made him aware of the risks associated with the land's former owner. He knew nothing of the kinds of men the man dealt with or if he would return for what he had left behind. When Richard returned, Acha was standing by the hearth, smoothing her tangled hair with her fingers. She looked cleaner now, her face and arms washed, although the cold air turned her cheeks into a soft red. She didn't look relaxed, but the acute panic of the previous night had subsided. Richard set down the bucket and took out a frying pan. "I'll make something simple," he said. Acha watched intently as he cracked eggs and stirred them over the fire. She stepped forward slowly, almost cautiously, and picked up a piece of stale bread left on the shelf. She offered it to him without a word, providing help in the only way that felt comfortable. He took it, "Thank you." While the eggs cooked, she moved around the room with quiet steps, taking in details she hadn't noticed the night before. A cracked cup on the shelf, a loose floorboard by the door, the revolver resting on the table within Richard's reach. She studies the alarm the longest, his expression difficult to read. "Do you use this often?" she asked. "No, unless I have to." She absorbed the answer attentively, trying to connect it to the man in front of her. "Old man uses gun too much," she said. "He's shooting at the floor, at the wall, at me." Her voice hardened on the last word, but she didn't look away. Richard kept his composure. "That won't happen here." Achaz sat down near the table, pulling her feet under her, showing a little more confidence by placing herself in a vulnerable position with him above her. Richard served the food and slid a portion onto the table. She accepted it, eating slowly but with more appetite than the previous night. While he ate, she finally asked, "Why do you live alone?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of water, considering what she deserved to know. "I've worked in too many places where fights broke out over small things," he said. "I've lost good people because of bad decisions." Needing distance, Achaz shook her head, not pushing for more. "Alone and more secure sometimes," she said, her voice carrying a truth learned from painful experience. Richard looked at his wrists again, dark red and swollen. "We will put something about that today," he said. She lifted them slightly, surprised that he noticed. "If you have medicine, I'll do something with what I have." "It won't sting." She seemed uncertain of how to respond to the kindness. She folded her hands together and lowered her gaze. "I'm not used to someone seeing the injury," she admitted. Richard stood up and began clearing the table. "I see it," he replied, "but I'm not here to add to it." That stopped her. Her eyes widened with a kind of fragile disbelief, like hearing a language she had forgotten. A bang sounded inside the cabin as the broom unexpectedly fell from the shelf. Hatcha jumped violently, her heart pounding as she pressed herself against the wall. Her reaction was immediate and intense, showing how deeply fear lived within her. Richard calmly lifted the broom and set it upright. "It's just old wood moving," he said. "Nothing more." Acha exhaled, trembling, embarrassed but unable to hide how she was reacting. "I hear noise for too long and it's dark," she said, hard to stop. "It'll subside," he said, without judging her panic. She sat back down, pulling the coat around her. The firelight touched it, and for the first time, her shoulders dropped a fraction in a sign of emerging confidence. Richard looked toward the door, thinking about the repairs that needed to be done before nightfall. "I'll check the roof in a bit." "You?"